So now let's talk about frictions on the employee side of the market. So far we've assumed that employee movement is costless, but in reality that's not necessarily the case. And let's just look through some of these examples. So the law of one price. If mobility was costless, that means moving from one job to another. And that could be costless in a monetary or non-monetary way, and we'll talk about that. So if that was the case, then workers of equal skill get the same pay. Because if you weren't getting the pay you deserved, you could just easily go over to another job. Now, when that's the case, that's where we had our horizontal demand for the firm. Firms won't pay higher because they don't need to, and they won't pay lower because no one will come work for them. So that's where that law of one price came from, where the the horizontal or the perfectly elastic supply of labor for the firm. But this isn't the case with different locations paying different wages and some paying more in the same location. So not all wages are the same. Location is a huge factor. So if you ever taken anything with real estate, you know, what's the number one rule of real estate? Location, location, location. Okay. So there's huge costs of moving from one location to another. Right? And so if you want to get a job on the other side of the country, well, that's clearly not going to be costless because it's going to cost you a lot of money to not only do the search over there, but to pick up and move over there. Okay. So this just shows how mobility can be costly. Now, there's two types of mobility costs: monetary and non-monetary. So the monetary mobility costs, and by mobility, I don't mean just moving, I mean moving from one job to another. So your monetary mobility costs are going to be things like printing resumes, buying new clothes for interviews, if you're moving, the expenses of moving. But there's also non-monetary mobility costs. And the biggest one is uncertainty. So when you go from one job to another, you don't know what you're going to get from that new job. You know what you have at the current job. Now you may not like that, but it gives you an idea that that unknown, it causes a lot of uncertainty. You also don't know if you're going to be a good fit at that job. Other non-monetary costs are going to be time searching. It takes time to search and interview for jobs. There's also a lot of stress. You also need to think about giving up your non-wage benefits. So if you leave a job, right, you may be getting benefits here that you're going to be losing. So all of these are costs that you have to think about as you're searching for jobs. Now, when we look at this, because of the mobility costs, the supply cost to firms becomes upward sloping. Right? Which means that because of the mobility costs, if a firm wants to attract more people, get more people that they want to come work for them, they need to pay higher wages. Because not everyone can just pick up a job, pick up everything and move 200 miles. Right? If the firm needs more people, they're going to have to pay higher wages for them. Now, how much higher really depends. And so, for example, we have our less elastic demand and our more elastic demand. And so when the pay goes from $9.25 to $9.50, if the demand is less elastic, which is going to be the case when the cost of moving is not very costly, okay? Or sorry, when the cost of moving is very costly, that 25-cent raise is going to get a increase in labor supply, workers who are willing and able to work, going from E0 to EM, or EO to EN. With the more elastic, where it may not be as costly to move, you're going to see a bigger increase. Okay? So this is why we have the, if the firm wants to get more and more people to come, they're going to have to pay higher wages because it's costly to move. So they have to attract people to come and want to work for them. Now, another example of a friction on the employee side is a monopsonistic labor market. That means there's only one buyer in the market. And so, for example, that can be a one coal mine in an isolated town. And if that's the case, then the market supply equals the firm supply. The firm's the only one buying it. Now, it's still going to be upward sloping. Now, if you remember when we talked about profit maximization, we said they're going to continue to hire workers until it is, or while it is profitable for them to do so. And so the profit maximization condition was if the marginal revenue product of labor equals the marginal expense of labor. Now, when there was this one, when it was a competitive market, all right, there was just that one wage. But here, not necessarily the case. All right, so let's look at why that is. So this is showing that the wage offered, how many units are supplied, and what's the total hourly cost. Okay. And so when we look at that, when you go from $8 to $9, the supply of labor goes from 10 to 11. So this brings in the mobility. All right. So when the wage goes up, more people are willing and able to work. And so the total hourly cost goes up by 19. When you go from 9 to 10, the supply of labor goes from 11 to 12. So it goes from 99 to 120. 10 to 11, 12 to 13, 120 to 143. Now, if we look at the marginal expense of labor, and the marginal expense is going to be the change in your, say, total cost of labor divided by the change in labor. So the additional cost of additional unit in labor. Okay. So, erase this here. So you look at this, you see that the marginal expense is getting higher and higher. Well, why is that? Because if we look at this, each additional dollar is bringing in one more unit of labor. So you would think, well, why wouldn't that be the same? All right. And here's why. Let me take this off here. So let's say we go from $8 to $9. Okay. Now, when that's happening, the labor supply is going from 10 to 11. So when going from 10 to 11, your wage is going from $8 to $9. So you might be saying to yourself, well, wait a second, why is the marginal expense just $9? Because that's what you have to pay that 11th worker. The problem is that's not the case. Because what you have to do is, so when you go from 10 to 11, right, you're going to have to pay that one worker the $9. Right? But you now have these 10 other workers that were making $8 and they're now making $9. So you can't just pay the 11th worker $9. You have to have that one wage of paying everyone. So what happens is that expense, when you go from 10 to 11 workers, it's going to be the 10 workers times each worker is going to be getting $1 more. They went from $8 to $9. And so when you do that, 10 times 1 is 10, plus 1 times 9, which is 9. That's where you get your $19. So it's going to cost you $19 if you want to get that 11th worker. Let's say now we want to get a 12th worker, so we go from 11 to 12. Well, to get the supply to 12 workers, you need to have a wage of 10. So how much is it going to cost to hire that 12th worker? Well, let's see. So that 12th worker, when you go from 11 to 12, it's going to cost you $10 for that 12th worker. But the previous 11 workers, which were making $9, are now making $10. And so those previous 11 workers, which you had here, you're paying them $1 more. So now you have 11 times 1, which is 11, plus 10 is $21. So now, why is it that this is going up? Why is it that the marginal expense is going up? The reason why is that as you raise this wage offer by $1, you're going to be paying more and more people that 11th dollar. Right? And so the first, when you go from 10 to 11, you're paying 10 people that extra $1. When you go from 11 to 12, you're paying 11 people that extra $1. When you go from 12 to 13, you're paying 12 people that extra $1. And so as it goes up, the marginal expense is going to rise because you're going to be paying more and more people that extra wage. Okay. So let's see what that looks like. So you have the supply and you have the marginal expense of labor. And you can see that if as we look at different units of employment, right, when we go from 10 to 11, 11 to 12, 12 to 13, right, the wage is going up by 1, okay, but the marginal expense is going up by 2. So you can see that the higher it gets, the higher the amount of employment, all right, the bigger divergence there is between the two. So profit maximization. All right, how do we maximize our profit? Well, again, profit maximization is where the marginal revenue product of labor equals the marginal expense of labor. Okay. Well, where is that point? It's right here at X. So where that equals each other, that's where you get your profit maximizing employment level. But what are you going to pay them? Are you going to pay them this amount up here? No, you're not. Why would you? Because remember, the supply of labor, that tells you at each wage how many workers are willing and able to work. So let's just say this is $10 and this is $15. So if you wanted to get E, number of workers, okay, at $10, that's how much, that's E star is how many workers would want to work. So why pay them 15 to get this E star if you only have to pay them 10? So where the marginal expense equals the marginal product of labor, okay, that's where you're going to get your profit maximizing employment level. If, however, or after that, however, to figure out how much to pay them, you just want to look at the supply. You want to say, all right, well, how much do I actually have to pay these workers to get that many workers? And that's where at that employment level you figure out where on the demand curve it is. Or sorry, where on the supply curve it is, rather. And if we look over here, if something happens that affects supply, it's also going to affect the marginal expense of labor. And so our original is we have a marginal expense of labor, our supply, where the marginal expense equals the marginal revenue product. That's right here. And so initially, there, and so when you plug that into the supply curve, that's the wage. Now if supply decreases, the marginal expense is going to change too. Okay? And so where the marginal expense of labor equals the demand of labor, or the marginal revenue product, is at E prime. You go to where it hits that new supply, W prime. And so this just shows what happens when we're looking at the non-competitive market on the buyer side. Now, how is a minimum wage affected in this market? Well, what happens is that a minimum wage will cause the wage not to be able to get to this level down here. And so where the marginal expense equals the margin revenue products is point A. And so E star, or E0 is where we're going to be, but the wage is going to be at the minimum wage there. Okay. Now, this gets us closer to the more the equilibrium wage, but because the wage that they want to pay is less than the minimum, it does impact it. So these are the frictions on the employee side of the market.